Welcome back. You are watching the Ike Wingate Show, where we are endeavoring to bring critical thinking back to America by shining a light into the dark corners of our government, our culture, and our media. There are so many things that are happening right below our noses that we don't even realize, but they have an effect. They start small and subtle, and then we wake up and it's a huge problem. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is one of those things. And you're seeing some of these stories in the mainstream. We, of course, had the Bud Light thing where people boycotted Bud Light. It was a huge deal. Now you have these other companies that have been discovered to be promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. It sounds nice. Oh, everyone gets a fair shot. But what happens is people are promoted that are not competent, and then they're putting people's money into all these woke things like trans parades and things like that. So several companies have walked back their DEI policies because they've been exposed. Molson Coors is the latest, but Ford, John Deere, Brown-Forman, Lowe's, Harley-Davidson, and Tractor Supply have been some of those companies that have walked back these policies after a threat of a boycott. Now, it's also infiltrated our military. And specifically, we have this story that just came out today that a U.S. Navy warship commander was relieved of duty after an image of him shooting a rifle with a backwards scope was discovered. And this is Commander Cameron Yaste. So he was relieved of his duty. The scope is backwards. And guess who they put in place of this guy? They put Captain Allison Christie. Now, people online think that this is actually a man. I can't corroborate that. I can understand why they might. And here's kind of the strange place that we're in society today is when someone is put in power or in a place of notoriety or publicity, and they look, if it's a woman that looks a little handsome or a man that looks effeminate, people automatically now assume that they're trans. So that's one of the unintended consequences. But this is just case in point where we're talking about where DEI has come in place. We don't know for sure if Captain Allison Christie is the most qualified, but we do know that our military branches, specifically like the Navy, are putting diversity, equity, and inclusion ahead of competence. And our next guest, Tom Burbage, is a retired Navy captain. He knows all about this. He's a former Navy test pilot, and he's author of multiple books, but specifically, Don't Give Up the Ship is the new book that he and a group of his fellow Navy men have put together. Welcome, Captain Burbage. Glad to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Ike. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
So you have been involved in developing and testing the F-22 and F-35 aircraft. Can you give us kind of a brief summary of your experience and what brings you to today?
Well, my background is I'm Naval Academy graduate. I spent about 11 years on active duty in the Navy, including going to test pilot school and working on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, USS Eisenhower. And I spent 33 years in industry. I had about a 14-year overlap there where I was in the reserves flying A-7s out of California. But my industry career highlights were the F-22 program, and then followed quickly on the heels of that with the F-35 program.
Well, we thank you for your service. And obviously, the DEI issue is quite important to you, as you, along with this group of folks called the Calvert group, I understand you guys were golfing friends at the Naval Academy and over the years have stayed in touch, but this issue of DEI in the military is the driving force behind developing this new book. Is that correct?
That's certainly part of it, Ike. We were enjoying our retirement years and playing golf now and then and couldn't remember each other's email addresses, so we grouped them under something called the Calvert group. And about 2020, about 4 years ago, pre-COVID, we started hearing some things that didn't sit well with the requirement to build leaders in the military and some of the fallout impact it was having on the military in general. Certainly DEI was one of those. As you said in your opening remarks, the words are deceptive, particularly the E one, the equity one, which is equal outcomes as opposed to equal opportunities. And that is very antithetical to the warrior ethos and the development of strong leaders for the military. So we came off the golf course, decided to get involved.
Excellent. Well, I definitely have read most of the book and found it really, really educational, kind of scary, but not surprising. And so what you are seeing here is that this started in sort of the Obama era. Is that sort of where it started as far as making it a point to specifically, the directive to integrate women in combat situations? And, people that are watching this show, I don't want you to think, oh, this show is anti-women. No, talk about that, because obviously you know very well why it's important that you are, in the trenches, so to speak, with your fellow serviceman or woman. Why is it important that the best are brought in versus what looks the best?
The start of this was really back almost in the 80s, but it sort of picked up steam in the 90s. And then, of course, it got very accelerated in the COVID years when there was a lot of restrictions that were placed on pretty much everybody. And when you look at the service academies, which is where we started, that's kind of an embryo of society in general. It's very affected by the candidate pool, kids going through the K through 12 system. It's very affected by the need to retain leaders once they get in and get trained, and all those expenses are done. And it's very critical to readiness of the fleet. And none of those three are actually doing very well right now, which may be a reflection of the impact of this ideology change on the service. We were concerned seeing separate chains of command set up where the DEI group, sort of the social experiment in the military, was separate from the normal chain of command. And it was expecting people to come through that chain of command with issues they had with their leadership. Well, that's antithetical to the military. The military is built on unity. It's built on a meritocracy. You want the best person, doesn't matter what color they are, doesn't matter what gender they are. You want the best person for the job leading your kids and other kids that join the military and become the volunteer force.
You talk about unity, and that's what struck me while reading this, is that you want the people that you're serving with, because you're going into intense life and death situations. The last thing you want people doing is looking around and seeing what's different about you. Rather, you want a unified front that you have in common, this greater good together. But the DEI seems to be causing the exact opposite. And let's look at how we are not the same, and what divides us rather than what unifies us. What kind of effect does that have in an intense operation situation?
Well, it's disruptive. And that's why the military is probably the last part of our society that should even embrace this ideology change. What you're seeing, and you mentioned it with your companies in the beginning, capitalism and the military are the opposite of DEI. There are other places where it makes sense. The words make sense. They're gentle, but they're not in life and death situations. They're not in financial performance metrics that are constant pressure. Those two particular groups have demonstrated that they're backing away from the issues. And on the commercial side, the industry side is called ESG. It's got other names. It's one of the arts or talents of the DEI proponents is they're able to change the name and change the acronym, but it's still the same thing. So you have to be educated enough to scrape beneath the surface and see where that happens. But it's basically the science of oppressors and oppressed. And as that enters into a military environment, you suddenly get disruption in leadership chains of command. It's been said that trained officers lead wars. Civilians fight them because of the need to man the forces, and you shouldn't want your children in the hands of anything less than the best and people that are promoted on performance and meritocracy.
So the effects inside these military groups, we're seeing things like you outlined in the book, recommended reading for people going through, say, the Naval Academy or other military training that has everything to do with sexuality and trans ideology and things like that? What are they telling people is the reason they need to read these kind of books?
Sometimes it's that you're going to enter the fleet, you're going to be in a young division officer responsibility, you're going to face these kind of problems. So it's an educational process so that you understand what kind of problems you may eventually face. There's a difference between holistic thinking and learning and indoctrination into a new ideology. And there's a very fine line between those two. You know, this movement started in the Ivy League universities, and it's drifted down. And as I said, in the K through 12, it's right in my local neighborhood here with elementary and junior high schools. Parents taking their children out of those schools in some cases to do homeschooling because of what they're being taught. I think if the COVID experience had one advantage, it was that parents got to look over their students' shoulders and see what was being taught. And you saw some angry parents go in front of school boards and try and get that direction changed. So we're starting to see I think we're starting to see the pendulum come back a little bit now. As I say, we've been doing this for 4 years now. And I think the awareness of the general public and society and the military in general is becoming more and more evident. This is not the way to go. So, but it really goes through the whole thing. And when you look at, for example, the ultimate measure of our military is readiness, and you look at how we're doing in terms of number of ships available, in terms of number of recruits in the pipeline, in terms of almost any metric you see, we're not doing so good.
Yeah, I was going to talk to you about that because the ships are down from, in 2018, 355 was the number it had to be. We're down to 293 now, and recruitment is down. And I mean, this isn't the Navy, but like if you see some of these Army recruitment videos,
Right.
and so there's so much emphasis on trans people in the military. Just from somebody outside of the military, I'm going, I wouldn't want to be part of that. And I sure as hell wouldn't fear an enemy that was prancing in drag. And so how bad is it for the security of the American people, do you think?
The challenge that you have when you have a recruiting shortfall and an all volunteer force, you got to put those two terms together. You can always go back to when I graduated in the late 60s, we had a draft. Okay, we haven't had that for years, but you have a certain manpower level that's required to man the ships and man the Army battalions and man the Marines. If you don't meet those quotas, so to speak, then you have the only alternative you have is to relax the standards. If you're going to allow in subpar personnel to meet the numbers, you're going to, by definition, lower your standards. And that's a real problem. Doesn't mean that there can't be different standards for different elements of the force, but you have to be very careful that you're not neutering the force in general by that. Just the lack of recruits and the difficulty that the services are having on long-term retention of trained individuals, you've got a void that's being created inside what is one of the basic requirements of a constitutional republic, which is to have a strong defense.
Right. Yeah. One of the main tenets of having a federal government in general is to be able to protect the country. Right. And
Correct.
where we're at right now is the Navy is responsible primarily our best defense against China potentially. Right. And it seems, as what you guys point out in the book, is that seems to be where maybe our biggest threat comes from. Would you mind talking about that?
Well, we have sort of two ongoing conflict areas in the world right now, in Europe with the Ukraine situation and in the Middle East with what's going on there, which is a tinderbox if we're not really careful over the next short period of time. The third area is the Pacific. That's a really big area. A lot of people don't realize how big that is. And there aren't many land masses in there, and there aren't many allies in there. So we have to be able to bind together and fly and fight. In Europe, you have NATO, you have the U.S. strong presence in many of the countries there. You have air forces that cooperate and fly together. There's somewhat starting that now in the Pacific. If you look at the United States and its deployable carriers, look at Australia, look at Singapore, look at Japan, they're all investing in U.S. arms, particularly the F-35 program. So they'll be able to fly and fight as a multiplied unit. But the Pacific is where the next conflict is likely to be. I hope it doesn't happen, but it's likely to be. And that'll be a seagoing war. That'll be a ship-based naval exercise in the large part.
So there are things like drag shows happening on ships, and we see the recruitment geared in that direction. Is it possible? What's your theory about where this is all coming from? Because we've showed a Chinese spy basically arrested yesterday that was part of Kathy Hochul's team, Andrew Cuomo's team, pushing DEI and things like that. And what we've also seen is China's been behind promoting these kind of initiatives in the US, but not in their own country. So is this all just a way to weaken our society, weaken our military, weaken our capitalist society as well, to make us a weaker country all around?
That is a really good question, Ike. And I think if you look at the Rubik's Cube, so to speak, of issues that we have right now, it's a weakening of the military. It's an open border, allowing who knows in terms of military age young males across. There's a number of things that would say that there is an agenda being worked to weaken the U.S. and its role in the world and in general. You mentioned in your opening remarks Christian base, the conservative base. If you look at who has formed the bulk, not all of it, but the bulk of the military personnel in the past, it's that base. It's Christian in general. It's conservative in general. It's the opposite of what we're seeing trying to be forced on it through the social experimentation that's penetrated all of society, schools, military, whatever. And as it's done that, it's in general weakened from our perspective as Americans and as patriots and as a constitutional republic. You hear the word democracy thrown around like it means something. We're a constitutional republic.
Yep.
We're not a democracy. The word isn't even in the Constitution. So we have to, it's almost like civics have been lost. When's the last time you saw an American flag in a classroom? When's the last time you saw a Pledge of Allegiance in front of the class, which we did every day growing up? Well, it's that eats away at the patriotic sense. And as the military becomes subject to social experimentation, which is what it's become subject to, in our opinion, over the years, it can't help but reduce standards, reduce unit integrity, impact the military in general. Thank God there's still a lot of patriots in the world, and now veterans coming off the couch that are concerned with this.
Yeah. So tell me about where we go from here. We see that things are not going in the right direction. And a lot of times people, watch this show. We tell them everything that's bad that's going on. We try to sprinkle in some good and some action. And what can you do? We don't want to leave them in a place of despair. And you and your fellow Navy servicemen are active. Like you said, you're getting off the couch, not just playing golf, right? And so you have a burden to get this out there. And so what can others do? Where do we go from here?
The toughest thing, in my opinion, right now is that we live in a world of sound bites. Okay, we live in social media platforms that some of us don't even know how to access. And so people get their news and their information about the state of the world and the state of the union through alternate channels. That's the world we live in. As we do that, you have to look at how do you incentivize or disincentivize where the country needs to go. It has to be a deeper dig. You have to take the peels off the onion. You have to be willing to spend the time to understand the real issues the country's facing, because it's hard to find ground truth anywhere right now, particularly in the lead up to an election. It's very difficult. So how do you do that, and how do you provide the right incentives? Personally, I think in peacetime or general peacetime, it's a different situation than when the world is very tenuous and potentially very dangerous. This could be one of the most dangerous times in the history of our country and the world in general, with 3 hotspots now building almost daily. So in that scenario, how do you get the right set of incentives in place, and how do you get it's also a bandwidth issue. If I'm trying to train leaders and get leaders to step up and take their responsibility, I don't want to fill that bandwidth with things that don't add any value to the development of the warrior ethos. And we've gone through a lot of that lately. And a lot of that is the reason for people not joining, and for generational military families like mine that may not recommend their kids or grandkids to even apply. I mean, there's that level of sentiment down there. So how do you fix it? I'm not sure, other than to try and increase awareness, particularly as very important decisions are coming up relative to what direction this country's going to go.
Yeah, I saw in one section of the book, it talked about, you have to be engaged with what's going on. You go to school board meetings, get involved with what's going on with the schools, engage everywhere you can in the process, and then, start there and fan out, basically, because you have to engage, you have to speak up. Part of the thing that we talk about around here is we're trying to make it normal to speak the truth and normal for free speech to occur, rather than being in an echo chamber where you're only hearing one point of view and everyone's afraid to speak up, even though everybody's actually thinking the same thing, but everyone is afraid to say it. Courage is contagious, kind of thing. So, any other thoughts on how people can put boots in action on something like this?
I think it's a grassroots kind of a thing. I think it is representing your position, your point of view, trying to help others understand it. You have to listen. You can't just broadcast. You have to listen to other points of view and try to influence where you think those points of view are wrong. But it takes a large effort. It takes people willing to get off the couch, as we said, and go do that, and go talk to folks and email folks, and basically get out the vote, so to speak. You don't have to influence the vote, but get it out. It's important. It's our way of life. It's what America is all about. So preserving this constitutional republic is not easy. It's not going to be easy going forward because of the varied points of view that exist throughout the whole spectrum of generations, all the way from what kids are being taught in very junior school, what's being taught in universities, what's being taught at the service academies, even in some cases.
Yeah, so you're talking about get out the vote, and I want to ask you briefly about this. You mentioned in your book how the being forced to take the COVID vax had a really detrimental effect on the Navy and other branches. It created a decline in trust. It also harmed recruitment. What do you think about Donald Trump's statement that every military member who was fired because they wouldn't take the vax would be rehired with back pay and an apology from the government?
That's one alternative, certainly. I met with myself and a couple of other my Calvert group friends met with some of the SEALs down in Virginia Beach that were not taking the vax. These were highly trained, late 20s, been on combat deployments, sitting there talking to them like you and I are talking. I would have been very happy to have my daughter bring one of them home, as the guy. Just very strong Americans, but they had a religious objection to doing it. They were in the fittest of the fit relative to physical fitness in the military, and they were drummed out. They were basically pulling weeds in the BOQ yard, waiting for somebody to tell them what to do. It was a real travesty. It opened my eyes to what was going on. Those kind of decisions are personal. I think now we're learning there's a whole lot about the COVID experience that was probably not directed in the right direction. I don't know. I saw a very good interview with the doctor that was on a number of the stations that was asking for scientific data for some of the decisions on shutdown classrooms and stuff like that. By the way, that's another huge factor in the candidate pool, is the impact of that couple of years of weak education, so to speak, leading up to high school graduation. In many cases, not even having high school graduation. So yeah, I think those are all important things, and I think they're, that could be an alternative. I'm not sure that anybody's costed it out and done the forensics on it to see whether it's a smart thing to do or not, but it certainly shows faith and belief in the folks that made those decisions.
Tim Walz has come under a lot of scrutiny. Obviously, Army National Guard, and I know how you guys are with the other branches. With you have your special you have your special nicknames for all the other branches, right? And so, do you have any thoughts on this stolen valor subject and how you know you hear from a lot of servicemen and women that are not okay with it? They think it's that they try to use analogies for how bad or how devastating or how the level of betrayal is just incomprehensible. From your perspective, what do you think about it?
From my perspective, we're in the end game of an election, and there will be lots of distortions of facts. Did some research on the Stolen Valor Act of 2013. There was one in 2005 that was turned over in 2013 by the Supreme Court for freedom of speech issues. But basically, it says stolen valor is when you claim to have earned a badge or a medal of honor. The SEAL Trident, in my mind, is probably the most abused valor. People claim to be SEALs and never went through SEAL training. Things like that. It's basically claiming that you won an award or you achieved a level that you didn't achieve. There's another case, another way to think about some things, and that's whether you distort your military career for political gain. And unfortunately, that's not uncommon in Washington. There's several high-profile cases that you're aware of, I'm sure, in the past. What Mr. Waltz, in my opinion, did in terms of legalities is he may have distorted his military career somewhat for political gain. I don't think you could technically call that stolen valor because he didn't claim to win a medal. He claimed he carried a gun. I can't argue that whereabouts of that, but I think we're seeing a number of things like this as we get closer and closer to the election, which are meant to, again, get into that soundbite world where a little soundbite might be able to change a vote.
Right. Okay, and then let me ask you about this Arlington National Cemetery scandal that's going on. The Gold Star families say that Kamala Harris, Joe Biden have not made any attempt at contacting them, though they were invited to attend, and they say that Donald Trump used it as a political stunt, even though the parents of these Gold Star families came out and said that they wanted pictures. And so it seems to me that the media is creating a scandal that isn't there. But the real concerning things that have come out in my mind is the fact that when there was the dignified transfer, Joe Biden was caught looking at his watch multiple times, and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden didn't even return phone calls when invited to this event. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. We're hearing that from the Gold Star families themselves. But is this indicative of a broader opinion that maybe the Biden administration or Harris administration doesn't truly respect our military, or is it being blown out of proportion?
I think this is a really serious event. I think that the Afghanistan withdrawal, by every measure I've read about, was a debacle. It should not have happened the way it happened. Not that we shouldn't get out of there, but we shouldn't have gotten out the way we did. And to label it a success and get it in the rearview mirror was important for the Democratic Party to get the news cycle off of it. And every time it's resurfaced, and this was the 3-year anniversary of the death of the 13 military members at Abbey Gate, that's a very important thing to remember for the American people. And to let it go by at Arlington National Cemetery without any recognition is criminal in my own mind. It's almost like stealing valor from the Gold Star families and their kids that were involved. So I think it's a very serious thing. I think it is political. I think President Trump was acting in his best interest and in the interest of the Gold Star families, which is how we should operate. I think, again, get it off the news cycle as fast as you can is the mentality of the folks that were responsible for the big event, 3 years ago, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So I think you're seeing politics play out in this one also. But to me, it's much more serious than Vice President's misrepresentation, perhaps, of his military service.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay, very good point. So I know we're running a little over time. If you have time for one more question, I want to make sure everybody sees this book. Don't Give Up the Ship. It says woke politics are endangering our military and our nation. It's written by this group along with Captain Burbage, and they call themselves the Calvert Task Group. And you can pre-order this right now at calverttaskgroup.org, calverttaskgroup.org. And so, Captain Burbage, would you tell us your opinion on how close we are or are not to World War III? We're seeing some people asking that in the chat. It's on the minds of a lot of people, especially with concern that the guy that's in charge of our country really isn't in charge. We don't know where he is. And the idea of Kamala Harris having access to nuclear codes is quite frightening for many people. What's your take, and maybe some of your colleagues? Obviously, you have conversations regularly. What's your opinion on that?
I think we have good systems. We have good leaders at the top. I think we're in a much more dangerous situation than we've been in perhaps since I graduated 55 years ago from the Naval Academy. Most of my contemporaries went into the end of the latter stages of the Vietnam War. There's been periodic wars since then in Iraq and Afghanistan, but not on the level of a world war. They're regional conflicts. But the fact that we have 3 hotspots right now, and the Pacific is the next one, unless it can be contained. It's clearly we're in a dangerous situation right now, and we need strong leadership that recognizes that, not just in the military, but the military is controlled by the civilians. We need it in the Congress. We've been supporting veterans for either party that are coming out of combat that are willing to sacrifice and run into the Congress. Is one of the things we've been trying to do, support the new folks that are coming in. But I think it's a real tough set of issues that we're wrestling with right now, and it's not made any easier by the different perspectives. Our founding fathers wrote about domestic and foreign enemies. We can sit there and point at the foreign enemies. Sometimes you can't quite point at the domestic enemies, but the domestic enemies are the ones that make us weaker as a constitutional republic and weaker as a military.
Would you agree or disagree with this statement that now seems like a really good time for China to attack Taiwan?
Well, there's a lot of distractions going on. It's hard to figure out who's actually in charge making the big decisions sometimes in DC, and particularly as we go into these last 2 or 3 months leading up to the election. Everybody's distracted by the election process, much more so, I think, than maintaining an even keel in the world situation. But it's important, and hopefully we have people in the right places that are watching that and making those decisions. But it's not clear. It's not a clear situation we have right now, and I think we're vulnerable.
Understood. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your service. The book, again, is Don't Give Up the Ship. When is this going to be available for purchase? And is there anything else that you want to let everyone know about the book, the project, or any parting thoughts or words?
It's a series of essays that we've wrote over the last 3 or 4 years. And so there's a time sequence to it as the world changed during this kind of interesting during those times. This is not written by academics. It's not written by professional journalists. It's written by veterans. And it's a substantial book. It's a series of essays, so you can read one in 5 minutes. You don't have to sit there and follow a plot through the whole book, but it is an interesting time sequence of the issues that have faced us as a country and as a military over time. So I recommend it. And again, this is a step along the way. As we write these individual essays, and most of them have been published, they have a 48, 96-hour shelf life. When you put them in a book and compile it, I get to talk to people like you. That's the main difference that's the reason we have the book, is it opens up the podcast genre, which can help us get the word out and maybe change a few minds on what the real issues are that are facing the country.
Excellent. I would recommend it for sure. I actually really enjoy how you are able to get a very nice, cohesive, beginning to end thought in sort of bite-sized chunks. And like you said, you can read it, put it down, come back to it, but you will be better for reading this. And I've read a lot of it. I actually learned something I'd never heard before about the Constitution, Woodrow Wilson's view of the Constitution about do as much good for as many and using the Constitution that way versus what's it labeled as, the Madisonian style of looking at the Constitution. I thought that was extremely educational. I didn't know that. So I absolutely enjoyed reading about that and understanding more about it. And then you can see through the lens of the distortion that is done with the Constitution, and you sort of see maybe the concept that they're working off of and why it seems that they haven't read the Constitution. They have, they're just applying it in their own special way that is not good for our country, in my opinion.
Well, it's like we said, everybody takes an oath. Everybody in government takes an oath. All of us take an oath to the Constitution when we come into government service, particularly in the military. To many, it means something. To others, it's a ceremonial process, and it doesn't mean what it should probably.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for your time. Many comments wanting me to thank you for your service. Thank you for the information. And we will be sure to add the link to pre-order in our chat and show notes so people can find that. You're welcome to come back anytime. I'm sure I could probably talk to you for hours about all the things that we would love to know. And hopefully we'll have you back soon. But thank you again for your time. Thank you for your service, Captain Burbage.
Thank you very much, Ike. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, you as well.